Alright, party people, it's Thursday night, 10 o'clock. Time to record a lecture here. Turn this brightness down a little bit so it doesn't have all the glare off my glasses. Okay, so we left off talking about sarcopterygians and the transition to tetrapods. Not necessarily that sarcopterygians turned into tetrapods in the same way that chimpanzees didn't turn into humans, in the same way that coelacanths didn't turn into amphibians, right? But that sarcopterygian are the closest living relative to the tetrapods, and that they shared a common ancestor not too long ago. Okay, but then this totally new clade evolves, called the Tetrapoda, the four-legged creatures. Includes amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay, it happened a long time ago, and here's some of the intermediate fossils. Some that probably are not the common ancestor, but as similar to the common ancestor as we're probably going to get. And we talked about the specific morphological traits that characterize the first tetrapods. So we see a lot of this has to do with their limbs. Right? They have a wrist, so they have a palm and a foot that are articulate with their limb. And the limbs have a single arm bone, two lower arm bones. Their head becomes separate from the rest of the spinal column, so they can move their head side to side, up and down. But it's interesting that these characteristics that really we tend to think of as being a tetrapod, and really that we have, and all of the terrestrial tetrapods have, evolved in the water. Okay, they were pre-adaptations to terrestrial existence. Okay. In fact, some of the early tetrapod, things like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, actually had internal gills. So they had lungs, they had limbs, but they also had gills. Right? So here's some of those fishapod things that are sort of in this transition. Acanthostega, see that very solid spinal column. We're starting to see these girdles attaching the limbs to the spinal column, flattened skull, Tiktaalik, very terrestrial looking animal, but was aquatic. Okay. There's again all of these. A real common theme with transitions is that we see a lungfish and we see an amphibian, and it's tempting to think that lungfishes turn into amphibians, but no, the common ancestor of both turned into these, and common ancestor, and so on and so forth. There's many steps in between a lungfish and an amphibian, but the difference is, or the issue is, that all of these transitional intermediate fossils organisms have gone extinct. Okay, just more. This is right out of your book. I really recommend, if you're going to read one part of the book, a couple parts of the book, read this chapter on the transition to land and early tetrapods. That's a good treatment of this topic. Looking at the homologous structures here. Right, we see these opercular bones that are part of the skull, later evolving into a shoulder blade. We see the humerus is maintained in the first terrestrial organisms. Probably some of these rays, the bones that are involved with the fin, become our digits. Right? Overcoming gravity, right, requires some pretty impressive morphological traits. A lot of these have to do with the spinal column and these processes that allow muscles to attach, ligaments to attach, to keep this column from twisting and torquing. We get ligaments and muscles like the rectus abdominis or the nuchal ligament, which act to hold up this arch. Right. So this creates some tension, and this muscle allows the tension to remain in the spinal column, like a suspension bridge. Okay, all these pre-adaptations evolved again in aquatic ecosystems. The limbs with feet. This is probably related to animals. The original story goes that they lived in waters that dried up continually, so they needed to be able to adapt to living on land. But really, the evidence from fossil beds suggests that they lived in shallow waters in either estuaries or marine or freshwater. It's not clear which type of ecosystem, but that the water was shallow and choked with vegetation, and so the ability to kind of bowl through this with some type of limbs and feet was an adaptive trait. So maybe to access prey that was on the edge of the water. Okay. Snouts become elongated. This has to do with the sensory mode of looking around in the air. It has to do with dealing with that interface, the surface of the water and the air. Looking at the girdles, elbows, processes on spines. The tail fin, right? Now the fin is going to start to reduce, and it's going to be more of just a tail. And then the rigid spine. Again, all these things are things that evolved in the water but made for an organism that could exist on land. And here's some, right, the same type of layers that you find fossils from things like Ichthyostega. You also find these giant tree ferns, horsetails, some of those more primitive plants that you learned about in plant bio, Equisedum and the pteridiophytes, that are the older non-flowering seedless plants that are primitive. At this point, they were there on the land and were really the dominant plants before flowering plants. Okay, so the Earth at the time, this is the Paleozoic period. I think it goes Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and this is in the Devonian and before. What is that? Probably like 300 to 600 million years ago. The Earth was very, very different, and we know that the Earth's climate is really largely or partly determined by the location and position of those continental plates. And so this is, at this point, there was a lot more of the continents were close together into, this was Silurian period, probably right at the cusp of tetrapod evolution. See North America and Eurasia together into this supercontinent called Laurasia. And then we have South America, Africa, Australia. This is the Indian subcontinent, and Antarctica were conglomerated into Gondwana. And then Gondwana land and Eurasia smashed together into Pangaea, which was this gigantic supercontinent. Some really weird stuff happening here. This is probably one of the times that the Appalachian Mountains arose, was when Africa smashed into North America and created an uplift, right? This period when Pangaea was together is when the first tetrapod fossils appear, and they appear in North America, they appear in Greenland, they appear in Eurasia, they appear in parts of the Asian, what becomes the Asian continent. Okay, and this at the edge of the ocean, or in the estuaries, or in some of the freshwater areas too. At the time, in this Paleozoic period, again, thinking back to plants and thinking about plant evolution, plants had been around for a while, certainly in the ocean and in freshwater areas, but I think they're called charophytes, the original green algae that was the predecessor of all land plants. This is again right about the same time that land plants were moving out onto the land. The water that this took place in was shallow. It was probably warm. And so warm water, shallow water, stagnant water generally characterized by really low levels of oxygen. So that's where the lung was adapted, right? The ability to not just have to rely on your gills to get off your oxygen. Okay, so then vegetation moves out onto land, and then not far behind it really are these invertebrate animals that are taking advantage of those niches created by the land plants, arthropods, mollusks, these kind of things. Some recreation of what these ecosystems would have looked like. Some really bizarre non-amniote tetrapods, right? And then these sarcopterygian fish. Of course, there would have been actinopterygians, and there would have been chondrichthyes. Lots and lots of fish-like creatures in the water, and we're seeing this radiation of tetrapods moving out onto the land. So, what would the reinforcing forces, the reinforcing characteristics? I'm not sure. These are things, some advantages that if you can take advantage, if you can move on to the terrestrial environment, out into the terrestrial environment, then you would be given these advantages, and so that may make it adaptive to be able to utilize the terrestrial environment. Okay, because think about the food that is there. Has those animals have never been preyed upon by larger animals, because there weren't really any other large animals, and so they really have not evolved a lot of their defenses, defensive behaviors, defensive anatomical traits, chemical traits that allow them to evade predators. Juvenile dispersal, we see this in fishes too. If we go to a lake and we look in the real shallow parts of the lake, the juvenile fishes will live in those environments in order to get away from the adult fishes who will eat them. So there is a long history of animals using sort of that close to the land as possible to avoid getting eaten by big members of your species. So it could be that originally the juvenile members of these species would have been sort of moving out onto land first. And out there, right, very high levels of oxygen, right, you're able to move around and use behavioral traits to change your temperature really quickly. You could get in the sun, get in the shade. If you're in the water, you're pretty much going to be that temperature that the water is, right? So there's many more options, thermoregulatory options on land. Competition, right? You're the first one there. You don't have anybody to compete with. And then think about all the predators that exist in the aquatic ecosystems. Okay? So a lot of good reasons to move out onto land, and this is thought to be the selective forces that pushed certain lineages further and further in the direction of terrestrial existence. There's Dunkleosteus again, just a big badass fish that you would not want to be in the water with, right? Keep going back to this, but this is really important, right? Here we got all the tetrapods from here to here, starting with some of these extinct stem tetrapods, temnospondyls, leptospondylus, anthracosaurs. So many of these groups have gone extinct. And then if we go back into the sarcopterygians, lots of those have gone extinct. We just now have the lungfishes, the dipnoi, and the coelacanthiformes, right? And they are, if we go back to this common ancestor, is the common ancestor of smooth or list amphibia. These are the modern living amphibians, and the sarcopterygians. Bunch of tetrapods evolved then, and only two seem to make it through there was a big extinction at the end of the Permian. Yeah, the beginning of the Permian era, and on land and in the ocean, so like a majority of living things went extinct. Right, and the two of the lineages that survived include the modern amphibians and then the amniotes, and that's really the rest of the class, mostly in the amniote group. That includes turtles, the squamates, such as snakes and lizards, the crocodilians, the birds and mammals. And that's where we're headed next. Next, we're going to talk about amphibians on Monday, and then Wednesday is your first test. I will get some study questions together, especially for the essays. I won't tell you exactly which essays are going to be on the test, but say there's going to be 5 essays, I'll probably give you like 8 or 10 that you should know, and I'll pick 5 from them to put on the test. So stay tuned for those, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Keep working on those projects. I've had some great conversations with some of you. Others, right, things are getting stalled, and we really need to pick up on that, because right, you still have to have time to put together your data, analyze it, put together a poster. So please don't wait. I've not really asked a lot of you guys in terms of work for this class. Put that time into working on your project. So, folks.